All right. This is the audio accompany of the Chapter 3, Section 3 reading for content, The War for Independence. It is on in your American history textbook, beginning on page 94. So as you listen, go ahead and follow along, be answering the questions on your reading for content. We're going to start with an American story. Colonel Henry Beckham Livingston could only watch helplessly the suffering around him. A veteran of several military campaigns, Livingston huddled with the rest of George Washington's army at its winter quarters at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. The winter of 1777 to 1778 was brutally cold, and the army lacked food, clothing, and other supplies. Huddled in small huts, soldiers wrapped themselves in blankets and survived on the smallest of rations. Livingston described the army's plight in a letter to his brother Robert. Our troops are in general utmost naked and often in a starving condition. All my men except 18 are unfit for duty for want of shoes, stockings, and shirts. Poor Jack has been necessitated to make up his blanket into a vest and breeches. If I did not fear starving with cold, I should be tempted to do the same. The opposing sides. The struggle at Valley Forge was a dark hour for the Patriots. No one knew if they were strong enough to defeat the powerful British Empire. On the same day the Continental Congress voted for independence, British troops, called Redcoats because of their uniforms, began landing in New York. By mid-August, an estimated 32,000 men had assembled under the command of General William Howe. This was an enormous force in the 1700s, and the troops were disciplined, well-trained, and well-equipped. Given their strength, the British did not expect the rebellion to last very long. The Continental Army was comparatively inexperienced and poorly equipped. Although more than 230,000 men served in the Continental Army, they rarely numbered more than 20,000 at any one time. Many soldiers deserted or refused to enlist when their terms were up. Others left their posts to return to their farms at planting or harvest time. Paying for the war was another challenge. Lacking the power to tax, the Continental Congress issued paper money. These Continentals were not backed by gold or silver and quickly became almost worthless. Fortunately, Robert Morris, a wealthy Pennsylvania merchant and banker, personally pledged large sums for the war effort and arranged for foreign loans. In addition to the Continental Army, the British also had to fight the local militias in every state. The militias were untrained, but they were adept at sneak attacks and hit-and-run ambushes. These guerrilla warfare tactics proved to be very effective against the British. Another problem for the British was the disunity at home. Many merchants and members of Parliament opposed the war. If Britain did not win quickly and cheaply, support for the war effort would erode. Therefore, the United States simply had to survive until the British tired of the economic strain and surrendered. The European balance of power also hampered the British. The French, Dutch, and Spanish were all eager to exploit Britain's problems, which made these countries possible allies for the United States. To defend against other threats to its empire, Britain had to station much of its military elsewhere around the world. The Northern Campaign. The British knew that a quick victory depended on convincing Americans that British military superiority made their cause hopeless, and that they could safely surrender without being hanged for treason. General Howe's strategy, therefore, had two parts. He placed many troops in New York to intimidate the Americans and to capture New York City. He also invited delegates from the Continental Congress to a peace conference, promising that those who surrendered and swore loyalty to the king would be pardoned. When the Americans realized that Howe had no authority to negotiate a compromise, they refused to talk further. Although Howe's peace offer was rejected, his military strategy was initially successful. Washington's Continental Army was unable to prevent the British from capturing New York City in the summer of 1776. In the fall of that year, Washington moved most of his troops from the northern end of Manhattan Island to White Plains, New York, crossing the Delaware. After Howe managed to push Washington troops back from New York City, he moved his forces towards Philadelphia, where the Continental Congress was meeting. Caught by surprise, the Continental Army had to move quickly to get in front of Howe's forces before they reached Philadelphia. By the time Washington's troops reached Pennsylvania, the weather had turned cold. Both armies halted the campaign and set up winter camps to conserve food supplies. Attempting to bolster morale, Washington had Thomas Paine's latest pamphlet read to the troops. Paine's words reminded all that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will in this crisis shrink from the service of their country, but he that stands it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. From The American Crisis. At this point, Washington decided to launch a daring and unexpected winter attack. On the night of December 25th, 1776, he and some 2,400 men crossed the icy Delaware River from Pennsylvania to New Jersey. Then they marched about 9 miles and during the sleet storm, defeated a group of Hessian mercenaries at Trenton. Several days later, the Patriot Army overcame 3 British regiments at Princeton. After those small victories, the Continental Army camped in the hills of northern New Jersey for the winter. Philadelphia falls. In March 1777, British General John Burgoyne had devised a plan to combine his troops with General Howe's and isolate New England from the other American states. Unfortunately, Burgoyne did not coordinate this with Howe, who was launching his own plan. Howe sent about 13,000 men to launch a surprise attack on Philadelphia. He believed that capturing Philadelphia and the Continental Congress would cripple the revolution and convince loyalists in Pennsylvania to rise up and take control of the state. Howe's action was a military success, but a political failure. He defeated Washington at the Battle of Brandywine Creek and captured Philadelphia, but the Continental Congress escaped. Furthermore, no loyalist uprising occurred. The Battle of Saratoga. Unaware of Howe's movement to Philadelphia, Burgoyne continued with his plan. In June 1777, he led an estimated 8,000 troops from Quebec south into New York. Believing Howe was marching north to meet him, Burgoyne's forces easily seized Fort Ticonderoga, but American forces blocked their paths by felling trees, and they removed crops and cattle to deprive the British of food. Burgoyne eventually retreated to Saratoga, only to be surrounded by an American army nearly 3 times the size of his own. On October 17, 1777, he surrendered to General Horatio Gates. Over 5,000 British troops were taken prisoner. This was an unexpected turning point in the war. It not only dramatically improved American morale, but also convinced the French to commit troops to the American cause. The alliance with France. Although both France and Spain had been secretly aiding the Americans well before Saratoga, that battle's outcome convinced France that the Americans could win the war. On February 6, 1778, the United States signed 2 treaties with France that officially recognized the new nation and committed France to fight alongside the United States until Britain was forced to recognize American independence. In 1779, Spain allied with France, but not the United States. These countries provided vital military and financial aid to the United States. Their attacks also forced the British to divert troops and ships from their campaigns along the Atlantic coast. Other fronts. Not all the fighting in the Revolutionary War took place in the East. Patriots also rallied to the cause on the western frontier, out at sea, and in the South, the West. In 1778, George Rogers Clark took 175 Patriots down the Ohio River and captured several towns. Although the British temporarily retook one of the towns, they eventually surrendered to Clark in February 1779. The United States now had control of the West. American troops soon secured control of western New York as well. In the summer of 1779, they defeated the British and the Iroquois, their Native American allies in the region. The Iroquois had allied with the British, hoping that a British victory would keep American settlers off of Iroquois lands. The War at Sea. In addition to the war on land, Americans also fought the British at sea. Although the Congress assembled in a Continental Navy, no one expected it to defeat the huge British fleet in battle. Instead, the United States sent its warships to attack British merchant ships. In addition, Congress issued letters of marque or licenses to about 2,000 privateers. By the end of the war, millions of dollars worth of cargo had been seized from British merchant ships, seriously harming British trade and economy. Perhaps the most famous naval battle of the war involved John Paul Jones, American commander of the Bonhomme Richard. While sailing near Britain in 1779, Jones encountered a group of British merchant ships protected by 2 warships. Jones attacked one of them, the Serapis, but the heavier guns of the British ship nearly sank the Bonhomme Richard. When the British commander called on Jones to surrender, he replied, "I have not yet begun to fight." He lashed his ship to the Serapis so it could not sink, and then he boarded the British ship. After more than 3 hours of battle, the British surrendered. The Southern Campaign. After the British defeated Saratoga in 1777, General Howe had resigned. His replacement, Sir Henry Clinton, began a campaign in the South, where the British believed they had the strongest loyalist support. British officials hoped that even if they lost in the northern states, they might still keep control of the South, which produced valuable tobacco and rice. In December 1778, 3,500 British troops captured Savannah, Georgia. They seized control of Georgia's backcountry, while American troops retreated to Charlestown, South Carolina. Soon afterward, General Clinton attacked Charleston. Nearly 14,000 British troops surrounded the city, trapping the American forces. On May 12, 1780, the Americans surrendered. Nearly 5,500 American troops were taken prisoner, the greatest American defeat in the war. Clinton returned to New York, leaving General Charles Cornwallis in command. Patriots rally. Cornwallis moved next to Camden, South Carolina, where he stopped a Patriot force from destroying a British supply base. After winning the Battle of Camden, the British found the tide turning against them in the South. Although many Southerners sympathized with Britain, they objected to the brutal tactics of some loyalist forces in the region. One such group, led by a British cavalry officer named Patrick Ferguson, finally went too far in trying to subdue a people living in the Appalachian Mountains. A band of over-mountain men, as they were known, assembled a militia force. They intercepted Ferguson at Kings Mountain on October 7, 1780, and destroyed his army. The Battle of Kings Mountain was a turning point in the South. Southern farmers, furious with British treatment, began to organize their own militias. A new commander of American forces in the region, General Nathanael Greene, organized the militias into small units to carry out hit-and-run raids against British camps and supply wagons. The most famous of these guerrilla units was led by Francis Marion, who was known as the Swamp Fox. General Greene hoped that while militias destroyed enemy supplies, the regular army could wear down the British in a series of battles. Greene's strategy worked. In 1781, the Americans engaged the British at Cowpens and Guilford Courthouse, and both battles resulted in hundreds of British casualties. By late 1781, the British controlled very little territory in the South, except for the cities of Savannah, Charleston, and Wilmington. The war is won. In the spring of 1781, General Cornwallis decided to invade Virginia. If he could take control there, he could stop new supplies and reinforcements from reaching American forces in the South. The Battle of Yorktown. In May 1781, Cornwallis arrived in Virginia, where he joined the forces led by Benedict Arnold. Arnold had been an American commander, but had later sold military information to the British. When his treason was discovered, Arnold fled to British-controlled New York City, where he was put in charge of British troops and ordered south. Arnold and Cornwallis's forces began to conquer the state together. They encountered very little resistance at first and almost captured Virginia's governor, Thomas Jefferson. George Washington quickly dispatched troops led by the Marquis de Lafayette and General Anthony Wayne to defend Virginia. As the American forces increased, General Clinton ordered Cornwallis to secure a naval base on the coast. Following orders, Cornwallis headed to the coastal town of Yorktown. Cornwallis' move created an opportunity for the Americans and their French allies. George Washington and a French commander, Jean-Baptiste Rochambeau, led a joint force south to Yorktown. Meanwhile, the French Navy, under the command of Admiral Francois de Grasse, moved into Chesapeake Bay, preventing Cornwallis from escaping by sea or receiving supplies. On September 28, 1781, American and French forces surrounded Yorktown and began to bombard the British. On October 14th, Washington's aide, Alexander Hamilton, led an attack that captured key British defenses. 3 days later, Cornwallis began negotiations to surrender, and on October 19, 1781, approximately 8,000 British troops marched out of Yorktown and laid down their weapons. The Treaty of Paris. After learning of the surrender at Yorktown, Parliament voted to end the war. Peace talks began in Paris in early April 1782. The final settlement, the Treaty of Paris, was signed on September 3, 1783. In this treaty, Britain recognized the United States of America as a new nation with the Mississippi River as its western border. The British kept Canada, but in a separate treaty they gave Florida back to Spain, and they returned to the French certain colonies they had seized from them in Africa and the Caribbean. On November 24, 1783, the last British troops left New York City. The Revolutionary War was over, and the creation of a new nation was about to begin.